Representatives of Sudan's rival factions are meeting for ceasefire negotiations in the Saudi city of Jeddah. International mediators are hoping to secure a lasting peace, even as fighting continues in Sudan's capital, Khartoum. The conflict between the Sudanese army and the rival Rapid Support Forces paramilitary is now entering its fourth week.
Chaos in Khartoum. Among the thousands fleeing, international diplomats. Many had been involved just weeks before in efforts to transition from military to civilian rule. Now some are questioning whether they may have done more harm than good. In 2019, widespread protests were followed by a military coup that toppled the country's long-standing dictator. Eventually, there was a transitional power-sharing agreement between the military and civilians until elections could be held. Sudan had a new civilian prime minister and a transitional military council. This is where the trouble began. The council was chaired by General Abdel al-Burhan. His deputy was Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemedi, the leader of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. These men now lead the two sides in the conflict. Hopes for democracy were set back in 2021 when Hemedi and Burhan deposed the civilian government, but their differences over power sharing were hardening. Meanwhile, from the US,
if the military puts this train back on its tracks and does what's necessary, I think the support that has been very strong from the international community can resume.
The UN, the US and Britain, among other powers, resisted calls to sanction the military leadership, giving Hemedi and al-Burhan legitimacy while hoping for better results than their history of violence suggested.
Any transition is delicate, and in Sudan, we are at a particularly delicate stage of this transition. So I really call on all sides who are involved in the political process to go the extra mile to work towards prompt restoration of civilian rule in the country.
Naivete or pragmatism, or both. Amid protests, the US and Britain worked to bridge the generals' differences, while the generals were deploying their forces in the capital. And just weeks later, the war was on.
And for more on the situation in Sudan, we're now joined by Cameron Hudson. He's an analyst and consultant on African peace, security and governance issues. He's also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He joins us from Washington. Now, how much of a role do you think the West has had in fueling the conflict in Sudan?
Well, I don't think that I would say that the West has been fueling the conflict. I think if we look back at the negotiations, the mediation that's been taking place there for the last 6 months, I think it's fair to say that there have been some errors of omission and errors of commission. But of course, all of it, I think, intentioned around the idea of bringing civilians back into the rule of the country. I think the question is, did we put too much faith in what we were hearing from the military leaders that they were willing to submit to civilian rule? Did we do enough to isolate those spoilers who were against seeing the transformation of the country and the restoration of civilian rule? So I think there are things that we certainly got wrong, analysis we got wrong, but I don't think that the Western or international effort to find a way forward was the cause of the fighting that's broken out.
Do you see any one thing that the West could have done differently?
Well, I think that throughout this process, going back to 2019 and going back to the very start of the revolution, Washington and its allies in the West have prioritized the voices of those people with guns over people in the civilian, civil society, political leadership of the country. And we really need to have been investing much more in bringing those voices into a more formal conversation, demonstrating that they are, in fact, the true leaders of the country, demonstrating our commitment to the ideals of the revolution. I think that many in the West and in the international coalition, which now has expanded beyond the West because it obviously includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, you hear them talking about stability, and I think we have gotten away from the idea of democracy. Stability and democracy are not the same thing. What the Sudanese people are demanding is democracy. What they are trying to be served is stability. But of course, Sudan has never known stability under military rule.
But isn't stability a prerequisite of democracy?
Well, that is, of course, why Sudan has never had democracy, is because we have always made this notion of near-term stability a prerequisite for democracy. And what you have just expressed is the expression of diplomats who have been mediating this conflict now for 4 years, never able to deliver real civilian rule, real democracy. If we allow ourselves to be satisfied with this illusory idea of stability, then we will never achieve, and the Sudanese people will never achieve that which they are dying for today.
Now, what kind of leverage, then, does the international community to stop the bloodshed and to achieve at least stability as a first step?
Well, I think Washington comes to these talks this week with new leverage in the form of a sanctions regime that was announced last week by the Biden administration. We understand that they are using the threat of those sanctions to try to bring people to the table and to try to get them to at least concede on these small points around humanitarian access and ceasefire. Again, I think we have to question the durability of any agreement that comes under duress and that comes under threat. I think we have, these sanctions should have been levied long ago, and we should be negotiating now the terms under which we would remove sanctions, not negotiating the terms under which we would impose sanctions. So I think Washington and its allies have really gotten this backwards. We've lost the script in Sudan, and if we continue only talking to military leaders, we're going to continue to have this kind of false sense of security that won't last very long.
Cameron Hudson, the analyst and consultant on African peace, security and governance issues. Thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you.
Now, tens of thousands of people have fled the fighting in Sudan to neighboring countries. But not everyone is able to flee. DW spoke to a mother who is stuck with her children in Khartoum.
Some people left because they were in immediate danger. Their homes had been attacked, or they were forcibly evacuated by security forces in areas of heavy shelling. The residents were told to leave. In other areas, people found that they were going to be in the middle of ongoing armed conflict, and to avoid becoming quote-unquote collateral damage, they had to flee their homes. Some people were attacked in their homes, some were robbed at gunpoint, and so they chose to leave to safer places. We can't guarantee the safety of our family on the roads right now. I have 3 teenage sons. I have been through RSF checkpoints. They are manned by very young soldiers. And I don't want to put my children in a confrontation with them. The fact of the matter is that when you do decide to flee, you can't guarantee your safety. Right now, I'm also accompanied by my elderly mother, and so the evacuation routes that people have taken heading to Port Sudan or Dongola or Halfa in the north, headed towards the Egyptian border. For us, that arduous trip is not an option for health purposes and for safety purposes. We need the international community to take ownership of their role in what was framed as mediation over the past few years, but didn't listen to the voices of the people. It was obvious that the interests of the Sudanese people were not being centered at the narrative. It was all about politics, it was all about power. The demands of the revolution, freedom, peace, justice, seem to fall on the byroads. If we can guarantee that we can stay safely in our homes and a real ceasefire is reached, then we will stay. This is our country, this is our home. We don't want to leave our homes. We don't want to go anywhere. We just want to be safe We just asked for a functioning country, the country that we love, that we fought for. This is where we want to be right now. This is where we want to stay. This is our home.
And we are joined now by Peter Schumann, who's an expert on UN missions in Sudan. Welcome to DW, Mr. Schumann. We just heard there a Sudanese mother essentially accusing the international community of not listening, of not putting the interests of the Sudanese first. The Sudanese people have made very clear they don't want military rule. UN Special Representative Volker Perthes rejects these accusations, says the West is not at fault for the current crisis in Sudan. Do you agree with him?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about this very, very heartbreaking issue, the situation in Sudan. It is difficult to judge now at this stage who is at fault. I think we have a structural problem. Whatever a United Nations peacekeeping operation can do is extremely limited. And when I have one criticism about the mission UNITAMS, then this is that the international leading politicians in the Security Council never really supported politically the mission as they should have done. Remember in Sudan under UNMISS, the first mission, when we were at the brink of the mission collapsing, there were high-level politicians visiting Khartoum, Condoleezza Rice, others. They came and they really put the parties under pressure. This time we haven't seen this. Of course, the mission leadership must also signal very clearly to New York, to the Council, that there are limitations what the mission can do on the ground and where external high-level political support is required. This was not done. But in addition, I think the criticism we just heard from the mother in Khartoum is absolutely correct. We continue to neglect the voice from the civil society organizations, from the activists, from the community resistance committees, from others. This is currently again the case in these talks in Jeddah.
Mr. Schumann, the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has said himself that we failed to stop war from erupting in Sudan. So are you saying that the democratic movement essentially has failed because the international community has failed? There just hasn't been the support that was necessary?
Well, the word failure is a very simple one. I think you can track it down to different events. Yes, the international community was present in 2019. For example, Germany, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Heiko Maas, traveled to Khartoum. Abdel Hamdok came to Berlin end of 2019. He was received by Angela Merkel. President Steinmeier traveled to Khartoum and was met by everybody in the residence of the German ambassador. I was in Khartoum at the time. Sudanese friends told me, fantastic. They said, now we have the high-level attention, the high-level support. But then nothing happened. So it all fell into a deep black hole. This is what I mean. Once you start with an external intervention, you must see it through right to the bitter end, with political support, with financial support, with other support. This was not done. So yes, the criticism from the street, in my analysis, is justified. And the drama is that we continue. We still try to sort of legitimize US-led talks in Jeddah without a clear mandate from the civil society organizations.
Peter Schumann, expert on UN and UN missions in Sudan. Thank you so much for your analysis of this really very complicated situation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, so we are joined now by Yasmine Abdel Majid, who's a Sudanese-born writer and award-winning social advocate, now based in London. Yasmine, thanks so much for being here with us on DW. Can I ask you, first of all, what you make of what you just heard there from Peter Schumann on the UN's and the international community's role in Sudan?
In some ways, it's refreshing to hear the honesty, because I think people, on the streets in Sudan and activists in the diaspora and so on have been saying for some time now that the international community bears responsibility, did not listen to the people on the street, did not listen to the resistance committees who even, today are the ones on the ground finding ways to evacuate people, providing humanitarian assistance with very little international support. And so it is refreshing to hear folks in the international community say, OK, we bear responsibility, but in some ways, it's frustrating as well. On one hand, it's too little, too late. And on the other hand, things are not changing. Still today, there is the ceasefire talks in Jeddah. We're talking about a temporary ceasefire for humanitarian aid. And this is not even what, the civilians are not even at the table. We're still sort of having these regional high-level conversations, not even high-level enough to stop the fighting properly, but just sort of in this middling ground. So on one hand, it is positive to hear the international community talk about the responsibility they bear. But on the other hand, it's frustrating because it doesn't appear that things are actually changing in a positive direction.
Can I ask you on a personal level, what is it like? What does it feel like to watch this crisis unfolding from afar?
I mean, it's been heartbreaking. It's been utterly heartbreaking, especially because this didn't need to happen. This is not a war that the Sudanese people have a dog in. It's not a fight the people have a dog in, right? Because ultimately it's a war between two generals about who gets to be, the big dog in the presidential palace. The Sudanese people peacefully had a revolution in 2019, and their demands were very clear. We want a civilian government. We want a functioning state. The mother we heard earlier said we want a functioning, safe society. And now we find ourselves only 4 years later in a situation where Khartoum is being bombed by its own military. People are fleeing. There are basic things like food and water. And I mean, it has genuinely been heartbreaking because it's not at all where I thought any of us thought we would be when we had this wonderful revolution in 2019. I mean, it's been utterly surreal.
Can we talk about the international community's role again and the generals that you were just talking about? Did they put too much trust in the generals during the transitional period?
I think there is a sense from the international community that, if you've got one or two people that you can have a pragmatic, quote-unquote, relationship with, where they're a known quantity, then that is the easy short-term solution to some sort of transition or some sort of functional governance that you as an international community can understand. But the reality is, as we know in many societies, democracy is a little bit messier. And what the international community should have done is dealt with the civilian sort of resistance committees, the grassroots people who actually represented individuals and the Sudanese population, rather than sort of say, OK, the people that have taken power, the military leaders, those are the people we'll deal with. What are the people who actually fought for the revolution? What do they want? And how can we deal with them? I mean, even today, there's a civilian front, this letter that a group of civilians, including the resistance committees, the unions and so on, that represent the voice of the people who have said, here are 1, 2, 3 things that we want. But are they at the table with the international community? No.
Can I just ask you very quickly, though, how can they circumvent the generals? I mean, they're the ones with the money and the power.
Well, where does the money come from? Right? The international community also has a role in stopping the money getting to... Because these generals are not operating in a vacuum. They are operating in a society, in a global system where the money is coming from somewhere, where the support is and the legitimacy is coming from somewhere. And if we can target those, the international community has the ability to target their resources and their legitimacy and essentially push them out of the picture, push them out of the centre of the table and bring the people who represent Sudanese society into the centre.
Yasmine, Abdel, Majid, Sudanese writer and activist, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Alexander Rondes is a former EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, and he shared his take on the international community's role in the crisis in Sudan with me.
I've heard a number of complaints about the role that the international community has played, meaning that it has not been perhaps as forceful as it could be. And there may be, we'll find out in time and in due course, whether there's this that has legitimacy. The reality is that today the Sudanese feel abandoned, but let's be clear, not just by an international community, which evacuated, but by its own leaders. What we have are two belligerents who've decided actually to sacrifice the interests of all the civilians of Sudan, who are the 99% of the country, to pursue their own particular goals and ambitions, which tend to be more about power and money. So we should be very clear in that order of priorities here.
But nevertheless,
yes.
Nevertheless, don't you think if the democracy movement in Sudan had received more support from the international community, this all wouldn't have happened?
I would like to think that had one been far more energetic, quick, timely in the delivery of support back in 2019 onwards to the civilian government that had been installed under Prime Minister Hamdok, he and the civilians would have had the leverage and the oxygen, financial oxygen, with which to do the sort of politics that are needed to gradually consolidate civilian rule. And that's a process that would take time, but it would have need firmness and unity and speed in the way in which the international community acted. And I fear sometimes that wasn't synchronized sufficiently to have the desired political impact, and it left the door open for the armed groups to begin to, the military and the RSF of Hemeti, to begin to encroach again into power.
That's very diplomatically spoken, but who put the brakes on support for Sudan's democracy movement?
No, you can't. I mean, it's frankly too simplistic to ask who. Things happen, and they happen gradually because there are a lot of people who are involved in the international community, who in turn is negotiating with all sorts of interests within Sudan. So there's no one, you can't point a finger at any one. You can begin to look at what might have been the absence of a coalescence of absolute purpose. Now, let me put it to you another way. The fact that today now you have in Jeddah of Saudi Arabia the very senior Americans and very senior Saudis addressing an issue of avoiding an absolute collapse of Sudan, I wish that had happened a lot earlier. So the question then is, why were the capitals not moved to bring to bear the highest levels in order to prevent the situation in which we're in? That is the question that needs to be pursued a bit further. But at the very least, at least something is happening now. And let's hope to God it's not too late.
Now, the two sides are actually talking in Jeddah, as we've heard. In your view, and please briefly if you can, are the two sides actually interested in peace?
I think they know they've got no choice but to come to some agreement. The trouble is, will it be a temporary arrangement while they restock and catch their breath, or are they willing to be serious? That I don't know about. But I think they will want to show that they are ready to take arrange a temporary lull.
Thank you very much. Alexander Rondes there, former EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, joining us from Nairobi. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.